Welcome to Thinking Through the Darkness, a Lore by Spec podcast, with me, your host, Spec. This is a podcast where we talk through all of the pre-production that goes into making the theories that you see on the Lore by Spec channel and its associated channels. Let's get the shilling out of the way first. If you haven't gone and subscribed and liked and commented on the videos on Lore by Spec on the YouTube channel, please go ahead and do that now. That's one of the best ways that you can support me. This podcast is also available anywhere that you can find podcasts. So if you are listening, if you could like the podcast and maybe leave a little review, that does wonders for the algorithm on the podcast side, which really helps. And if you want to help support this podcast, this is the only one that currently doesn't use free tools. And since it's a paid thing, if you have the means to contribute to this, the link for this is in my description for my Ko-Fi. This helps me keep the light on and pay for all of the things that go into making this podcast a quality project. Something that came up for me when I was watching the new KH4 trailer is that we're no longer apartment based. A lot of the first trailer was very much about Sora waking up in this new world and the birth by sleep, not being able to distinguish between, at least for the viewer, what visions we were seeing of the outside world that could have simply been a dream versus what this flavor of reality actually has within it. And I talked a lot about in my What I Want to See in KH4 video on the podcast about how much I want things to slow down, for there to be a sense of deliberateness about the new phase that we're walking into, and really hinging on the fact that I want this to go somewhat persona-y, where there's a routine to his work, where he has to go and pay taxes to get a job, and before he's swept up again in all of the Kingdom Heartsiness. And that's something that, the more I sat with it, the more I wondered why. Because if you think about it, throughout the Dark Seeker saga, how many times have we had a home? Or even a bedroom? The last bedroom that Sora has is in Kingdom Hearts 1, and then Roxas has one in 2, at least Data Roxas does. And that got me to thinking, why are we spending a lot of time in the trailers and in the stills that we got when Missing Link was cancelled about objects of like a phone? We see a lot of inside of what look like very corporate buildings in the trailers. It's all very sterile. Even his apartment that he wakes up in, that we assume is his apartment, is very minimalistic. It's very sterile. It's a design choice for sure, but it's also not what we would normally see in terms of Japanese depictions of home. Now, admittedly, I'm coming from a very biased skew of any blogs I watch on YouTube and, abroad in Japan and those sort of content creators about what and, real estate in Japan. And none of them look like Sora's building. It's very manicured. It's very polished. It's very stylized. It's very clinical. But it's also very cold. There's no real indicator in any of those videos or in any of those trailers, that much life happens in that apartment. If this was Strelitzia's apartment, and she's been there for some time, we would assume since the events of being across. Admittedly, we don't know in terms of how time works, per se, across two different planes of existence, how the time would map linearly then, because let's face it, it's not going to, and we should probably abandon the concept of trying to map from millennia ago to where we are now in Quadratum. The only thing we do know is Strelitzia saying that from the events of the end of 3 to when Sora kind of comes to in Quadratum, it's been 7 days in their world, but it's been several years in reality. If Strelitzia has been living in that apartment, it's still very sterile and devoid of her personality, or of any personality. I have been hinting in a few of my podcasts that, Quadratum being prison-based, or this being some sort of facsimile of containment, I wonder if we're getting hints of that through the design choices. Because it is very sterile, and you would expect that if you've moved into a place, you would be wanting to decorate it and make it your own, and certainly Strelitzia has a personality. We saw it in Union Cross, we even see glimpse of her tendencies in the trailers, like she's clearly there to and wants to check in and maybe take care of Sora. That would sort of imply that she has, in some way or another, a caring, nurturing personality. It would imply that she has elements to her personality. If this was her apartment, you would expect there to be some sort of personality in that, but there's not. Equally with Sora, I mean, anybody who's ever moved would know this. It takes time to move into a new place, to hang up paintings, to make the place your own. So it would make sense that if it's Sora's place, that it wouldn't be decorated and maybe a little devoid of personality and the things that make Sora him. But the other side of that coin is sometimes people don't decorate or invest in things because they have a fear of moving, of things being swept up again. So, like, what's the point of buying XYZ if something's going to happen and then XYZ is gone? There's also the clinical nature of it being depicted how it is very minimally, of how that feels like it's by design. That in many ways they're meant to be another cog in the machine in this plan. It doesn't necessarily matter that it's Sora per se, it just has to be whatever abilities or thing that makes Sora useful in this particular situation. I bring up the Matrix parallel quite a bit, but it does feel like it is very much employee 2666, you know? It's giving Stanley Parable, it's giving, you are an employee at the office, you do not have any personality or defining feature or features about you. And I'm wondering how deliberate of a choice that is. That this is not an adventure about what we previously know. It's also, if you think about it, despite it being a different art style, which you would expect if this is meant to be more forward facing, more based in our reality or a Final Fantasy esque reality, is that it would look a certain way that we would expect it to, coming from the reality that us ourselves, the player, would be able to relate and establish to. But I want to deviate from art style in this specific nuance to thinking purely about the colour palettes that we've seen so far. And Kingdom Hearts 4 is currently very devoid of colour. If you look at Strelitzia, her hair is the adorning feature, but she's in black and white. Sora himself, his predominant colour palette is red and black. Anyone else who we have seen, if that is actually Valley, he's in black. If you look at Luxord, he's also in black. Sigurd is the only person who has a bit of colour, but he is also wearing purple and black. We look at anybody who's in the organization coats. Hopefully we get a name for what those coats are actually meant to be called. And they're black too. The overall suburban colour palette of, I don't know, Quadratum is, outside of banners and advertisement, are predominantly greys and blacks and whites and very minimal-ish colours. Even if we look at the Heartless in terms of their constructs, while it's true that pureblood heart shadows and neos have always been darker blacks and navies, our enemies have always had colour. If you think of the nobodies, our dusks, our dancers, are all very colourful. Even the name escapes me, but they're the enemies from Kingdom Hearts 1 that are elemental based, that fly around. The little sprites. They are coloured. Their colours represent their element. The worlds we go to are also predominantly colourful. I'm thinking of even our more stoic, more structured places, our San Fransokios and stuff like that. Yes, there was a predominant kind of darker colour palette, but there was still personality. There was still, it wasn't so clean, San Franokyo. There was still lights, there were still colour, there was still buildings and trash cans, and Twilight Town similarly in 3 was very, red brick and roads, and with the adjacent wood near the old mansion. It was still always very bright and very colourful, even if you think of Arendelle itself in the town, thatched houses, wood buildings, busy markets, cobbled roads for the dancing minigame in the plaza, all very bright and colourful. We don't see any of that in Quadratum. The only things that we have seen that have been colour have been outside of Quadratum, specifically in those shots from the first trailer where we don't really have a confirmation of what those worlds are. But there is a juxtaposition that kind of needs to be dug into, that when Sora awakes, he moves from this sort of rich, luscious wood density, flora, fauna, to this very sterile, stylized, contained world that he is now in. Even thinking of the NPCs that we see in the trailer, none of them themselves are very colourful. It's like somebody turned down the saturation in Quadratum. That's the only way I can really feel like I can describe it with any sense of confidence. Everybody is also stylized and dressed very similarly. Everybody's very business casual. There's nobody walking around in funky hoodies or doesn't look like they're off to some sort of meeting. There's also, interestingly, there's no kids. There's no animals. There's no indicator of the other beats of life that are meant to exist within a city. You would expect that Quadratum would have the same structures if you're trying to depict a world that us, the players, would relate to, where there would be hospitals, schools, parks, that kind of thing, roads. But there's nothing like that we've seen so far within the trailers. It just seems to all be this very narrow depiction of what a modern capitalist metropolis is meant to look like. And obviously there's only so much you can get out of what is essentially, what 5-6 minutes total of source material. So obviously I don't know. But it's been pinging around in my head long enough that I feel like there's stuff worth digging into about just how clinical and cold Quadratum feels and whether that is intentional. Right now, I'm leaning to very intentional. This has been Thinking Through the Darkness, a Lore by Spec production with me, Spec. Thank you so much for listening. I really appreciate you taking the time to hang out with me today. Just as a reminder, don't forget, if you haven't followed the Lore by Spec YouTube channel, go ahead and subscribe. It's free there. If you haven't taken the time to review the podcast or dropped a like and a comment, those really help too. And if you ever feel inclined to help me keep the lights on over here, head to Ko-Fi, which is in my description, to help support the podcast. Once again, thank you all so very much for listening, and I will see you all next time.